Mallory believes that the language developed out of the necessities of intertribal communications, necessities arising among nomadic tribes that differed from one another in spoken language, having originated in or continued to develop out of intertribal relations. This language became tribally convenient from the habit of hunters who found it necessary to be very stealthy in stalking game and approaching the enemy. Aha! So, that suggests then that the sign language was created and found so useful that they started using it on hunting trips and stuff to remain silent. Then, of course, finding similar uses in warfare, in hunting and war. So it spread, supposedly, says Mallory, it spread from use among the tribes out into hunting and war. Having accounted for its more or less universal use among all Indians, Mallory next proceeds to account for its discontinuance in the timbered and mountainous regions, and by a process of elimination, leaves it as a survival on the Great Plains. It was formerly used, Mallory says, in the Oregon country, but gave way there to the Chinook jargon, composed of Indian, English, and French terms. Farther north, the Chinook disappeared after a time, but Russian entered and was used in much the same way that Chinook had been. So why is it that they are able to replace sign language in the mountainous and forested regions with some sort of Chinook jargon or with Russian terms? And why do they remain using the sign language on the Great Plains? Interesting question. Now, Mallory says that the lack of its continued use in the mountainous region, the reason that they left off using sign language, was because they weren't quite as nomadic as the Plains tribes. The Plains tribes were extremely nomadic. And the horse, he thinks, had much influence in promoting the language among the shifting tribes. So the horse being more used on the plains than in the mountainous and forested regions would push even more for the sign language to be kept. Now we skip a couple pages and we get to the author's thesis. The author says, it seems, on the contrary to these other views, to have arisen n-tribally, en-tribally, inside of a tribe, and to have developed slowly into intertribal use, to go outside of that tribe. In other words, it would have arisen and been widely used had all the Plains Indians spoken a common tongue. That's what the author says at this point. Even if every single Indian on the Great Plains spoke the same language, they would still have developed the sign language. That seems crazy, doesn't it? But we're not done yet. Down to the next paragraph. The sign, or more properly the gesture language, arose out of the necessity for communicating over great distances. Now he says the gesture language because the Indians, sign language can be spelling and stuff, and it's not necessarily all metaphor. But the Indian version used more metaphor and gesture. Quote, it was just as essential for the Indian to communicate with members of his own tribe as with the members of a strange tribe, hostile or friendly. Communicate with his own tribe through sign language? Quote, on the plains, the eye far outruns the ear in its range. Therefore, the ear could not there serve the purpose for which it was intended. Communication. Well, it wasn't intended, but for which it evolved. He probably believes in God. When for any reason the ear fails, men resort to the eye. This is true of the deaf and men in noisy mills, in storms, on the open sea, or on the plains. Aha! Well, there we have it, ladies and gentlemen. Isn't that interesting? That sign language was a development on the Great Plains, was used on the Great Plains, continued to be used on the Great Plains, was not supplanted by Russian or Chinook or whatever, because you can't use a spoken language on these great distances, but you can use the eyeball. You can see a really, really long ways. Continuing. The conclusion seems reasonable and to need no proof. It is true that when men of different languages meet, their ears fail them, and they do resort to signs. But in no case save that of the Plains Indians have signs been more than a temporary makeshift. to be abandoned as soon as a modus vivendi could be provided. So eventually French or Chinook or English jargon or Spanish maybe would have taken over as the language, and sign language would have been put out. But sign language had to remain because of the great vast size of the plains. So, interesting. Furthermore, there is internal evidence within the language, sign language, that would seem to indicate that the Indian sign language was meant for use at a distance. It is true that there are many similarities between white man's sign language and the Indian sign language, but there are also marked differences, and it is these differences that are suggestive and valuable as clues to the primary function of the Indian sign language. So, there are things about the Indian sign language which make us believe that it's for use at a great distance rather than for communication face-to-face. The following are some of the points of difference. Number one, the Indians, as a rule, made much wider gestures than deaf mutes. Their gestures tended to clear the body so that the signs could be seen against a background of light. So instead of doing like so, and in front of your body, your hands generally were out away from your body for the Indian language. They were air pictures, pure pantomime. Point two, the Indians used their arms more than the deaf, and only rarely did the sign depend on the action of a single finger. With the deaf, many signs are made largely by the fingers alone. So the Indians are all about with their arms with theirs, and using the hands mostly, fingers rarely, whereas deaf mutes are right in front of them with their fingers. 3, the Indians repeated signs more often than the deaf mute. So if you're face to face 2 feet from someone or 4 feet, that you're not going to need to repeat stuff as much as if you're at a great distance and you're trying to see this guy on the hill to see what he's trying to say about where the other army is or whatever, or where the buffalo herd's moving to. And he's going to repeat things several times to make sure that you saw and made no mistake about it. Whereas face to face this wouldn't be the case. Number 4. In making signs, the Indians use both hands more than do the deaf. And again, their hands out away from their body and so on. Number 5, Indians endeavored to keep the broad part of the hand, the palm, or the back to the observer, the fingers touching so that a solid surface was apparent. They didn't spread the fingers out. They used the hand as one unit and was always toward the person they're trying to talk to. The Indians' hands were held higher, swept through more space, and moved laterally to the right or the left so as to be seen with the background light. The signs could be distinguished at a far greater distance than those of the deaf, whose whole sign is made forward and in front of the body. There we go. That's little information about the sign language on the Great Plains, which I didn't know about and had never heard about until I read this book. It is doubtful if the signs used by the deaf for bird, eagle, and turkey could be distinguished at any considerable distance. Now, I don't know what the signs are, but imagine bird, eagle, and turkey or something like that, right? If you're very far away, you don't have any idea what these are, the difference between them. They might all look fairly similar. They might all look like bird of some sort, right? Quote, there is little motion in any of the signs. All are indicated with 1 or 2 fingers. None of them clear the body, and only one hand is used in these signs. The Indian sign for bird could be distinguished as far as the eye could see a man. The sign for eagle and turkey could be distinguished as far as the eye could see the hand. So if you can see a man, then you can see the guy saying bird. So bird must have been a very easy generic term, meaning no specific bird. If you could see their hands, you could see more detailed information. In every case, the whole hand is used. In every case, there is movement of at least one of the hands. In most cases, movement of both. If examined carefully, all these facts must convince the reader that the Indian gesture language could be read at a much greater distance than the deaf mutes. In fact, the deaf use signs, but the Indians use gestures, and a more accurate name for the Indian system would be